The air in the great palace of Constantinople was thick with a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. It was the kind of silence you might find in a deep forest just before a great storm breaks, a silence full of unseen energy and impending consequence. Outside the chamber, the distant murmur of the city, that vast living creature of stone and humanity, was barely a whisper. Inside, the only sounds were the soft rustle of silk robes and the gentle creak of polished wood. The light, filtering through high, narrow windows, fell in long, pale shafts, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos stood by a marble basin, his reflection a somber figure in the water's agitated surface. His hand, heavy with jeweled rings, traced the intricate carvings on the rim. He had the sharp, almost hawkish features of his dynasty, but today they were etched with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. His mind, always a restless engine of strategy and ambition, was turning over a single, vexing question. A question about the West, about Italy, and about the legacy he would leave behind. He had spent his reign trying to mend the schism between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West, to knit together the frayed edges of the Roman world. He had fought, he had negotiated, he had married princesses from distant lands. But now, as his reign drew to a close, he had to wonder if it had all been for naught. The grand tapestry he had woven, a masterpiece of diplomacy and war, felt suddenly thin and fragile. Did you know this was the knight Manuel I, the emperor who saw himself as a second Augustus, first truly doubted his own grand vision? His reign, from 1143 to 1180, was a high point for the Byzantine Empire, a time when its influence stretched across the Mediterranean, and its military machine was feared from the shores of the Holy Land to the plains of Hungary. Manuel was a man of immense charm and charisma, a knight emperor who delighted in jousting and hunting as much as he did in theological debate. He saw himself as a universal ruler, not just of the Greeks, but of all Christendom, the rightful heir to a legacy that stretched back 1,000 years. His court was a dazzling cosmopolitan hub, a melting pot of Franks, Normans, Italians, and Arabs, all drawn to the wealth and power of Constantinople. But this grandeur, this dazzling display of imperial might, was built on a foundation of dangerous overreach, of gambles taken on the world stage that risked everything. It was a golden age, yes, but one gilded with the gold of an empire stretching its resources to the breaking point. Manuel's story, and the story of the Komnenian Dynasty as a whole, is a fascinating one. It's a story of a family that dragged Byzantium back from the brink of collapse and gave it a century of relative prosperity and power. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The journey of the Komnenoi began with a whisper and ended with a scream. Their ascent to power in the late 11th century was a direct response to a crisis that had nearly brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees. The empire had been ravaged by internal strife and external enemies, most notably the Seljuk Turks, who had crushed a Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. This catastrophic defeat had opened up the heartland of Anatolia to Turkish settlement, forever changing the demographic and political landscape of the region. The first of the Komnenoi to take the throne was Isaac I, a brilliant general who seized power in a military coup in 1057. But his reign was short-lived, and he was succeeded by a series of weak, short-sighted emperors. It was Isaac's nephew, Alexios I Komnenos, who would truly save the empire. Alexios, a man of immense cunning and strategic genius, came to power in 1081. He inherited an empire in shambles. Its treasury was empty, its army was a shadow of its former self, and its enemies, from the Normans in the west to the Pechenegs in the north and the Turks in the east, were circling like vultures. Alexios spent the first decade of his reign just trying to keep the lights on, so to speak. He reformed the military, created new units, and most importantly, turned to diplomacy, using his family connections and a healthy dose of bribery to survive. A fun little tidbit: Alexios was so short on cash, he even had to melt down church treasures to pay his soldiers. Sacrilege? Maybe. But you do what you have to do to keep a 1,000-year-old empire from collapsing. The true test of Alexios' statesmanship, however, came in 1096. This was the year the First Crusade arrived at the gates of Constantinople, a motley but massive army of Frankish, Norman, and German knights, all headed for the Holy Land. Alexios had, in a sense, called them himself, sending a desperate plea to the West for military aid against the Turks. He got what he asked for, but not quite in the way he had intended. Instead of a small professional force, he got a human wave of enthusiastic but unruly warriors, a walking disaster of a crusade that he had to manage with the skill of a circus master's trying to herd cats. The relationship was fraught with mistrust from the start. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as devious and effeminate, while the Byzantines saw the Crusaders as barbaric and a serious threat to the very stability of their capital. But Alexios, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity. He skillfully navigated this perilous situation, extracting oaths of fealty from the Crusader leaders, and in a brilliant move, using their advance to reclaim many of the lost territories in western Anatolia. The legacy of Alexios: I was a powerful and consolidated empire, one that his son, John II, would inherit. John was a different kind of ruler than his father and his son. He was a quiet man, known for his pious nature and his somber dress, which earned him the nickname Palaiologos, or John the Beautiful, not for his looks, but for his character. He was a meticulous builder, a man who preferred to consolidate and restore rather than to expand and risk. He spent his reign slowly and methodically reasserting Byzantine control over the Balkans and Anatolia, bringing the empire's borders back to something resembling their former glory. He was a model of imperial virtue, and his reign, though less dramatic than his father's or son's, was a period of stability and renewal. Historians still argue whether his cautious approach was a missed opportunity for further expansion or a wise recognition of the empire's limitations. Either way, his work laid the groundwork for his son, Manuel I, to take the stage and, for a brief, glorious time, make Byzantium the dominant power in the Mediterranean once again. The story of the Komnenian Dynasty isn't just about emperors and battles. It's about a family's will to survive, and in doing so, to save an empire from the brink of oblivion. The crisis of the late 11th century was a slow-motion catastrophe. The The Byzantine army had been the envy of Europe for centuries, a professional, well-drilled force that could handle anything from nomadic incursions on the steppes to the complex siege warfare of the Middle East. But a combination of internal political squabbling and a shift in military policy had eroded this strength. Emperors had begun to rely less on the native, professional soldiers and more on expensive and often unreliable foreign mercenaries. They also started to neglect the theme system, which was the long-standing military and administrative structure that provided the empire with a steady supply of well-trained land-owning soldiers. When the Seljuk Turks, a formidable force of nomadic warriors, swept through Anatolia, the empire was woefully unprepared. The climactic disaster, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, was less a single decisive defeat and more the final gasp of a system already on life support. The emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, was captured, and the Byzantine heartland of Anatolia was lost, forever changing the balance of power. It was into this chaos that the Komnenoi family stepped. They were not from the old, patrician Roman families of Constantinople. They were an Anatolian military family, grounded in the traditions of the very lands that had just been lost. Their first foray into the imperial palace was Isaac I Komnenos, a formidable general who seized power in 1057. But his reign was brief, and he abdicated to become a monk just 2 years later, a shocking move that perhaps hints at the sheer weight of the crown in those tumultuous times. But the family's true political genius lay in his younger brother, John Komnenos, and John's son Alexios. John died young, but his widow, Anna Dalasena, was a force of nature. She was the matriarch of the family, a woman of extraordinary ambition and cunning who dedicated her life to ensuring her son, Alexios, would one day wear the purple. She used a network of family alliances and political maneuvering to patiently build a power base, all while the emperors who followed Isaac fumbled and stumbled. It was a classic case of playing the long game, and the long game paid off. By 1081, Alexios Komnenos, now a brilliant young general, was ready. He marched on Constantinople and seized the throne in a swift, almost bloodless coup. He was only in his early 20s, and the empire he inherited was a mess. The Normans, under the charismatic and ambitious Robert Guiscard, were invading from the west. The Pechenegs, a fierce, nomadic people, were raiding the Balkans from the north, and in the east, the Seljuk Turks were consolidating their hold on Anatolia. It was a situation that would have crushed a lesser man, but Alexios IV was not a lesser man. He was a master of improvisation. He turned to the one thing he had, his own family. He appointed his relatives to key positions in the army and the bureaucracy, creating a powerful, interconnected network of loyalty and competence. This was a controversial move, as it effectively turned the Byzantine state into a Komnenian family enterprise, but in the short term, it worked. It gave him a core of people he could trust in an empire full of traitors and opportunists. Alexios's reign was a constant series of diplomatic tightropes and military gambits. To deal with the Normans, he allied with the Republic of Venice, granting them huge trading privileges in exchange for their navy's support. This was a deal that would haunt the empire for centuries, but at the time, it was a necessary evil. He also famously faced down the Pechenegs at the Battle of Livonian in 1091, a decisive victory that ended the Pecheneг threat to the Balkans once and for all. It was a moment of true triumph, but the real test of his cunning was yet to come. In 1095, Alexios sent a plea to Pope Urban II for military aid against the Turks. What happened next was a fascinating example of historical miscommunication. Alexios had been hoping for a small, disciplined force of Western knights to act as auxiliaries for his army. Instead, he got the First Crusade. The Crusaders began arriving in Constantinople in 1096, a chaotic, unorganized, and massive force of pilgrims and soldiers. Alexios must have looked at this army and felt a wave of both relief and dread. He was a man who understood strategy and discipline. These crusaders were a force of religious zeal and individual ambition. They saw him as the slippery, duplicitous Greek emperor. He saw them as a barbarian horde that could destroy his city from within. He managed the situation with a masterful mix of diplomacy and pressure, feeding the crusaders, but also keeping them outside the city walls. He extracted solemn oaths of fealty from their leaders, promising to return any conquered Byzantine lands. But the Crusaders were not interested in restoring the Byzantine Empire. They were interested in carving out their own kingdoms. This clash of intentions would define the relationship between Byzantium and the West for the next century. But for Alexios, the First Crusade was a net positive. It distracted the Turks and allowed him to recapture important cities like Nicaea and several strategic coastal territories. It was a bizarre, unexpected alliance born of necessity, and it laid the groundwork for the century of Komnenian resurgence that would follow. The arrival of the First Crusade at the gates of Constantinople was a moment of profound irony for Alexios II Komnenos. He had asked for a few trained soldiers and got what amounted to a migration of entire peoples. The sight must have been astonishing. A chaotic flood of men, women, and children from different regions and speaking different dialects, all united by a single, fervent religious purpose. The initial wave, known as the People's Crusade, was a particularly unruly bunch, led by a firebrand preacher named Peter the Hermit. They were undisciplined, prone to looting, and quickly became a serious liability. Alexios, with a masterful display of diplomatic patience, ferried them across the Bosphorus as soon as possible, where they were promptly annihilated by the Turks. A harsh lesson, to be sure, but a necessary one that showed the dangers of an untrained mob. The second wave was a different matter. These were the professional knights and their retinues, led by powerful feudal lords like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and the formidable Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman rival of Alexios himself. This was the group Alexios had to handle with extreme care. His palace, with its high walls and guards, must have felt like a fortress against this tide of foreign power. He used a combination of intimidation and generosity, providing them with food and provisions, while also subtly reminding them of his own military might. His most important move was to insist that the Crusader leaders swear an oath of fealty to him, promising to return any Byzantine territories they recaptured from the Turks. The Crusaders, with their own ambitions, balked at this, but Alexios held all the cards. He controlled their supply lines, and they were in his city. They reluctantly took the oath, and a fragile, deeply suspicious alliance was born. This was a partnership of convenience, not friendship. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as a decadent, untrustworthy people who had failed to protect the holy sites. They were, in their view, the true saviors of the East. The Byzantines, in turn, saw the Crusaders as a bunch of violent, uncultured barbarians who had no respect for imperial authority or civilized life. Historians still argue about the true intentions of both sides. Did Alexios genuinely want to help the Crusaders, or was he just using them to advance his own agenda? Did the Crusaders ever truly intend to honor their oaths, or were they always planning to establish their own independent states? The truth, it's probably somewhere in the middle, a messy blend of self-interest and idealism. The Crusader advance was a strange dance. Alexios provided them with guides and intelligence, but he also kept a safe distance, not committing his own army to the most dangerous battles. As the Crusaders pushed east, they slowly but surely captured city after city. And just as they had promised, they returned a number of these to Byzantine control. But as they got closer to the Holy Land, the agreements started to fray. The Normans, led by Bohemond, a man who had already tried to invade the empire, carved out the Principality of Antioch for themselves, a direct violation of their oath. This act of betrayal poisoned relations between Constantinople and the Crusader states for a generation. Still, the overall result for Byzantium was positive. Alexios had used the Crusader hammer to crack the Turkish nut and had regained significant territory in Anatolia. It was a diplomatic victory, even if it came with a side of lasting resentment. The century that followed, the Komnenian Restoration, was one of the most successful periods in late Byzantine history. Alexios, having survived the Crusades, spent the rest of his reign consolidating his power and rebuilding the empire's military and economic foundations. He created a new, disciplined army, the Komnenian army, which was a professional fighting force that could stand toe-to-toe with any in Europe. He also fostered economic growth, rebuilding the urban centers and encouraging trade. By the time he died in 1118, the Byzantine Empire was no longer on its deathbed. It was, for the first time in decades, a great power once again. His son, John II Komnenos, inherited this renewed empire. John was a stark contrast to his father. Where Alexios was a master of political maneuvering and cunning, John was known for his piety and his straightforward, honest nature. He was a man of action, a warrior emperor who led his armies from the front. He was often called John the Beautiful, not for his physical appearance. He was said to be short and dark-complexioned, but for the beauty of his character. He was a rarity in the Byzantine world, an emperor who was admired for his moral rectitude. John's reign was less about grand, audacious campaigns and more about quiet, relentless consolidation. He spent his years on the throne, from 1118 to 1143, methodically expanding Byzantine influence. He campaigned in the Balkans, reasserting control over the Serbs and Hungarians. He then turned his attention to Anatolia, where he continued his father's work of pushing back the Seljuk Turks. He was a meticulous and persistent man, and he laid the foundation for the next Komnenian emperor to take the stage. John II Komnenos, or John the Beautiful, as he was remembered, was a ruler of a different character than his father, Alexios. Where Alexios was a political animal, a master of backroom deals, and calculated risks, John was a man of action and simple piety. He wasn't one for the political intrigues of Constantinople. He preferred to be on campaign, leading his armies from the front, sharing the hardships of his men. He was known for his personal bravery, often fighting in the thick of the battle, a trait that earned him the deep respect of his soldiers. This was an emperor who truly lived the life of a warrior, not just played at it. His reign was a testament to the power of quiet competence. He was a master of the slow, methodical advance, focused on rebuilding the empire from the ground up. His military campaigns were less about grand, dramatic conquests and more about a steady, relentless pressure on the empire's enemies. In the Balkans, he reasserted Byzantine authority over the Serbs and Hungarians who had been causing trouble along the northern frontier. He also turned his attention to the Pechenegs, the nomadic people who had been a thorn in the empire's side for decades. John crushed them in a decisive battle in 1122, effectively ending the Pecheneg threat forever. It was a victory that secured the empire's European borders and allowed him to focus on the more pressing issues to the east. A fun little detail. The Pechenegs were so thoroughly defeated that they simply disappeared from the historical record as a distinct people, a truly stunning end for a once feared group. But John's most significant work was done in Anatolia. He understood that the long-term survival of the empire depended on reclaiming the heartland of Asia Minor from the Seljuk Turks. He didn't try to retake all the lost territory at once. Instead, he embarked on a series of annual campaigns, a relentless war of attrition that slowly pushed the Turks back and re-established Byzantine control over key cities and trade routes. He built and fortified castles, he recolonized devastated areas with Greek settlers, and he slowly, meticulously restored the imperial presence in the region. This was not the flash and dash of a lightning conquest. It was the slow, steady grind of an emperor who understood that building a stable empire was more like laying a foundation one brick at a time. John was also a great patron of the arts and architecture. He commissioned the construction of the Pantocrator Monastery in Constantinople, a massive complex that included a church, a library, and a hospital that was famous throughout the medieval world. This wasn't just a work of religious devotion, it was a statement of imperial wealth and power, a clear sign that the empire was prosperous once again. His reign was a golden age in its own right, a quiet, effective period of stability that allowed the empire to flourish after the chaos of the late 11th century. However, John's reign was not without its challenges. He had to deal with the ongoing issue of the Crusader states in the Levant, particularly the Principality of Antioch, which had been founded on territory the Crusaders had promised to return to Byzantium. John campaigned in the region, forcing the Prince of Antioch to acknowledge Byzantine suzerainty. He also had a complex and often tense relationship with the powerful Republic of Venice, which you may recall had been granted extensive trading privileges by his father. John tried to renegotiate these terms, seeing them as a drain on the imperial economy, but the Venetians were a force to be reckoned with, and their commercial and naval power was already growing to rival that of the empire itself. This simmering tension with Venice would come to a head in the next reign, but John, for his part, managed to keep the peace. John's reign came to an end in 1143 in a most unusual way. He was on a hunting trip in Anatolia when he accidentally pricked his hand with a poisoned arrow. The wound became infected, and he died far from the capital in the remote countryside. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a man who had spent his life in the field. But before he died, he made a fateful decision. He passed over his oldest surviving son, the well-liked Isaac, and named his youngest son, Manuel, as his heir. The reason for this decision remains a source of debate among historians, but it set the stage for one of the most remarkable and ultimately tragic reigns in Byzantine history. Manuel I Komnenos, who ascended to the throne at the age of 25, inherited an empire that was more powerful and more prosperous than it had been in generations. His father, John, had given him a solid foundation, a full treasury, and a well-trained army. But Manuel was not a man for quiet consolidation. He was a man with a grand vision, a man who saw himself as a universal emperor, a kind of modern-day Roman Augustus. He was ambitious, charismatic, and deeply fascinated by the West, a trait that would both define and ultimately undermine his reign. Manuel I Komnenos, who ascended to the throne in 1143, was not content merely to inherit an empire. He wanted to shape the world. He was a man of his time and a bit of a maverick, a Byzantine emperor who was more comfortable with Western European chivalry than the staid traditions of his own court. He was an imposing figure, tall and strong, and he loved hunting and jousting, even participating in tournaments himself, a very un-Byzantine activity. He had a grand vision to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory, not just in the East, but to reassert Byzantine dominance in Italy and the Western Mediterranean. It was a vision that was both noble and, as it turned out, dangerously ambitious. Manuel's foreign policy was a complex web of alliances, wars, and marriages, all designed to achieve this grand goal. He saw the world not just through the lens of Byzantine tradition, but through the eyes of a Western knight. He was, in a sense, a multicultural emperor, one who spoke Latin, had a fondness for Western customs, and saw the Catholic world not as a heretical rival, but as a potential partner. This was a radical departure from the policies of his predecessors. He married two Western princesses, first Bertha of Sulzbach, a German, and then Maria of Antioch, a Crusader state princess. These marriages were not just for show, they were strategic alliances meant to secure his borders and give him a foothold in the political landscape of Europe. His first major test came in the form of a renewed Norman threat. The Normans of Sicily, under their ambitious king Roger II, were a constant menace to Byzantine interests in Italy and Greece. In 1147, Roger's fleet sacked the Byzantine city of Corinth and kidnapped its famous silk weavers, a devastating blow to the empire's economy. Manuel responded with a full-scale military and diplomatic effort. He launched a massive campaign in Italy, something that hadn't been done in centuries, and he formed a crucial alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III, his brother-in-law. Manuel's Italian gambit was a bold move. He sent an army to the heel of Italy, where they quickly recaptured a number of cities from the Normans. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the old Roman dream was within reach. But the campaign was a logistical nightmare, and the Byzantine army found it difficult to hold on to the territory they had conquered. The local population was hostile, and the Normans were a formidable enemy. Furthermore, the alliance with Conrad III proved to be fragile, and his successor, Frederick Barbarossa, was not interested in helping Manuel's cause. In the end, the campaign fizzled out, and the Byzantines were forced to withdraw from Italy. It was a costly failure, and it taught Manuel a harsh lesson about the limits of his power. But Manuel was not a man to be deterred by a single setback. He simply shifted his focus. While the West was his grand obsession, the East was his most pressing concern. The Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, who had been held in check by his father and grandfather, were a growing threat. Their Sultanate of Rum was becoming a powerful and centralized state, a formidable rival to the Byzantine Empire. Manuel launched a series of campaigns in Anatolia, not just to hold the line, but to expand the empire's borders and push the Turks back. These campaigns were largely successful, and for a time, it seemed as if the Komnenian resurgence in the East was unstoppable. Manuel re-established Byzantine control over the fertile valleys and coastal regions, and he built a network of fortifications to secure the frontier. He was, in essence, trying to reverse the tide of history that had begun with the Battle of Manzikert. Manuel's ambition was matched by his personality. He was a generous patron of the arts and sciences, and his court in Constantinople was a vibrant hub of intellectual and cultural life. He was also a passionate theologian, often engaging in fierce debates with bishops and patriarchs. He was a man of contrasts, a sophisticated intellectual who loved the rough and tumble world of jousting, an ambitious conqueror who was also a deeply devout Christian. His reign, in many ways, was a reflection of his own complex character, but all of this grand ambition and cosmopolitan flair was built on a foundation of dangerous overreach. He was fighting on too many fronts, making too many enemies, and his resources, while vast, were not limitless. This would all come to a head in the second half of his reign, when his focus on the West would prove to be a fatal distraction from the gathering storm in the East. Manuel I's grand vision for the Byzantine Empire was a two-front strategy, a delicate dance between East and West. His attention, however, was increasingly drawn to the West, to the glittering prize of Italy. He saw himself not just as the successor to his father and grandfather, but as a true Roman emperor, the rightful heir to the legacy of Augustus and Constantine. His campaigns in Italy were a reflection of this ambition. The Norman kingdom of Sicily was a serious threat, a powerful and aggressive state that had already encroached on Byzantine territory. By reasserting control over southern Italy, Manuel hoped to both secure his western flank and to reclaim the prestige that had been lost since the days of Justinian. This was not just a military campaign, it was a psychological and political statement. His Italian gambit was launched in the 1150s, a period of renewed conflict between the Normans and their rivals on the Italian peninsula. Manuel saw his opportunity. He sent a Byzantine army, filled with his most trusted generals, to the heel of Italy, a region that was once a part of the Byzantine Empire. The initial successes were promising. The Byzantines, with the support of a few disgruntled Italian city-states, managed to capture a number of key towns and forts. The Normans were caught off guard, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as if Manuel's dream of a Roman reconquest was within reach. But the Italian campaign was a logistical nightmare. The Byzantine army was far from home, its supply lines stretched thin, and its a few allies were unreliable. The local population, who had long since grown accustomed to Norman rule, were not always welcoming. The Normans, for their part, were not about to give up their territory without a fight. They rallied their forces and began to push back against the Byzantine advance. The war devolved into a brutal slog of sieges and skirmishes, a slow, grinding conflict that bled the Byzantine treasury dry. Meanwhile, Manuel was distracted by another major event in the West, the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147 in response to the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa to the Turks, was a different animal from its predecessor. It was led by two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Conrad I of Germany and Louis VII of France. Their route took them directly through the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and Manuel was faced with the same challenge his grandfather Alexios had faced: how to manage a massive, unruly army of foreigners passing through his lands. Manuel's relationship with the Crusaders was fraught with tension. He was married to Conrad's sister-in-law, a useful diplomatic connection, but the Crusaders were a serious liability. They were prone to looting and had little respect for Byzantine authority. In fact, a popular little joke at the time was that the Crusaders were less interested in saving the Holy Land and more interested in seeing how much gold they could borrow from Byzantine churches. Manuel, ever the pragmatist, had to walk a very fine line. He provided them with supplies and guides, but he also kept a close eye on their movements, ensuring they stayed on the prescribed path and did not cause too much damage. The crusade itself was a disaster. The German contingent, led by Conrad III, was ambushed and destroyed by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. The French, led by Louis VII, fared little better and were forced to retreat in a slow and painful march. The Crusaders blamed Manuel for their failures, claiming he had conspired with the Turks. Historians still argue whether there was any truth to these claims, but the fact is that the Second Crusade's failure poisoned relations between Byzantium and the West for a generation. It also had a devastating impact on Manuel's reputation, casting a shadow of suspicion over all of his future dealings with Western powers. In the end, Manuel's Italian campaign had to be abandoned. The Normans, with their relentless pressure, eventually forced the Byzantine army to withdraw. The grand dream of a Roman reconquest of Italy had failed. This failure, combined with the bitter aftertaste of the Second Crusade, forced Manuel to rethink his strategy. He realized that his dream of a unified Christian empire under his rule was not going to be achieved through military conquest alone. He would have to rely on diplomacy, on clever marriages, and on the ever-present threat of his military power. But the focus on the West had come at a great cost. It had drained the treasury, weakened the military, and, most importantly, had distracted him from the gathering storm on his eastern frontier, where the Seljuk Turks were becoming stronger and more organized with each passing year. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would define the rest of his reign. With his grand Italian ambitions Largely in tatters, Manuel I was forced to turn his attention to the east. While he had been preoccupied with the Normans and the Crusaders, the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia had not been idle. The Sultanate of Rum, with its capital at Konya, was no longer the fragmented collection of warlords it had been a generation ago. It had become a unified, powerful state under the dynamic leadership of Sultan Kilij Arslan II. The balance of power in Anatolia was shifting, and Manuel, with his characteristic blend of charm and military prowess, was determined to tip it back in his favor. His goal was not just to hold the line, but to push the Turks back once and for all and secure the vital trade routes and agricultural lands of central Anatolia. His campaigns in the east were methodical and largely successful at first. Manuel rebuilt and refortified the frontier, strengthening the Byzantine presence in a region that had been a battleground for centuries. He captured a number of key Turkish strongholds, and in 1162 he secured a peace treaty with Kilij Arslan II. This treaty, which recognized Byzantine suzerainty over a few key areas, seemed like a diplomatic triumph. It appeared that Manuel had succeeded where his predecessors had failed, in bringing the Turks to heel through a combination of military pressure and clever negotiation. But as with all things in medieval politics, the peace was a fragile one. The Turks, ever the pragmatic rivals, used the period of peace to consolidate their power and rebuild their forces. Manuel's Eastern policy was not just about war and diplomacy. It was also about the delicate art of maintaining a balance of power among the various Turkish factions. He would often support one Turkish warlord against another, a clever strategy of divide and conquer that had served the Byzantines well for centuries. He also had to deal with the various Crusader states, a complex and often frustrating task. His wife, Maria of Antioch, was the daughter of the Prince of Antioch, and Manuel used this family connection to try and keep the unpredictable Crusader states in line. He made a grand visit to Antioch in 1159, entering the city in triumph and forcing its leader to recognize his authority. It was a spectacular display of imperial power, and it seemed to reassert Byzantium's position as the dominant force in the Levant. But even with these successes, Manuel's reign was a constant series of challenges. The Second Crusade had been a disaster, and its failure had soured relations with the West. The German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a powerful and ambitious man, was a rival for the title of true Roman Emperor, and the two men's relationship was a constant source of tension. Manuel, with his love of Western customs and his desire for a unified Christian world, found himself caught between two competing visions of Europe. He was a Byzantine emperor who wanted to be a Western knight, and he was a man who tried to be a friend to everyone, a strategy that often left him with no true allies. The most enduring problem for Manuel was the growing tension with the Republic of Venice. The Venetians, remember, had been granted extensive trading privileges by Alexios I in exchange for their naval support against the Normans. These privileges had made Venice incredibly wealthy and powerful, and they were, in many ways, an empire within an empire. The Venetian merchants paid no taxes and enjoyed a privileged status that was deeply resented by the Byzantine population and by the local merchants, a bit like a modern multinational corporation getting a huge tax break in a small country. Manuel, recognizing that this arrangement was a serious drain on the imperial economy, tried to renegotiate the terms, but the Venetians were not interested in giving up their advantages. The rivalry came to a head in 1171. A series of riots against the Venetians in Constantinople led to a popular uprising. Manuel, seizing the opportunity, ordered the mass arrest of all Venetian citizens in the empire and the confiscation of their property. It was a dramatic and unprecedented move, and it plunged the empire into a bitter conflict with its most important naval ally. The Venetians, enraged by this betrayal, launched a massive fleet to attack the Byzantine Empire. Manuel, in a shrewd diplomatic maneuver, managed to stall the Venetian fleet with endless negotiations, using their delay to his advantage. The Venetian army, weakened by disease, eventually had to return home without a single major victory. But the damage was done. The relationship between Venice and Byzantium, once a vital alliance, was now one of open hostility. This simmering animosity would, in the long run, prove to be catastrophic for the empire. It was a slow-burning fuse that would eventually ignite in the most unexpected and devastating way. The reign of Manuel I Komnenos was a masterclass in the use of diplomacy as a tool of statecraft, and no instrument was more finely tuned in his hands than the political marriage. He was, in a sense, a professional matchmaker for the empire, using his own and his family's unions to weave a complex web of alliances across Europe. His first marriage, to Bertha of Sulzbach, was a strategic move designed to secure an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, a crucial counterweight to the Norman threat in Italy. Bertha, who was a sister-in-law to the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III, arrived in Constantinople in a grand procession, and her marriage to Manuel was a symbol of a rare and fleeting harmony between East and West. It was a union meant to bind two great empires together against a common foe. Manuel's next marriage, to Maria of Antioch, was even more significant. Maria was a Frankish princess from a Crusader state, and her marriage to the Byzantine emperor was a powerful statement. It was meant to bridge the gap between the Byzantine and Crusader worlds, to show that the emperor was not just a ruler of the Greeks, but a protector of all Christians in the East. This was a direct contrast to the popular perception of the Byzantines as distant and untrustworthy, a reputation that had been solidified by the failure of the Second Crusade. Manuel, with this marriage, was trying to mend fences and to reassert Byzantine authority in the Levant. He also used the marriages of his relatives to great effect. His niece, Theodora Komnene, was married to Baldwin III of Jerusalem, and another niece, Maria Komnene, was married to Amalric III, also of Jerusalem. These unions created a network of family ties that bound the Byzantine court to the Crusader kingdoms, a diplomatic move that gave Manuel enormous influence in the region. He was, in a sense, the godfather of the Levant, the final arbiter of disputes and the last line of defense against the rising power of the Seljuk Turks. This was a position of immense prestige, and it allowed him to project Byzantine power without having to launch a massive military campaign. But this grand global strategy came with a hidden cost. Manuel's constant focus on the West and his lavish spending on diplomatic missions and military campaigns were draining the empire's resources. The people of Constantinople who had grown accustomed to the quiet stability of John II's reign, were starting to grow restless. The constant influx of Westerners, with their different customs and their privileged status, was a source of friction. The Venetians, in particular, with their vast wealth and their virtual monopoly on trade, were a source of deep resentment. Historians still debate whether Manuel's westward-looking policies were a brilliant strategic move or a fatal distraction. Was he a forward-thinking visionary who understood the importance of a global outlook, or was he a naive dreamer who neglected the more pressing dangers at home? It's a question that has no easy answer. The most bizarre and dramatic example of this tension between East and West, and a perfect encapsulation of the era's intrigue, was the life of Manuel's cousin, Andronikos Komnenos. Andronikos was a handsome, charismatic, and incredibly intelligent man, but he was also a schemer and a serial opportunist. He was a master of disguise, a lover of women, and a man who was utterly unsuited for a quiet life. He was everything Manuel was, but without the discipline or the sense of duty. He was a force of nature, a kind of medieval rock star whose wild escapades and political intrigues were the talk of the town. Andronikos's first major rebellion against Manuel ended with his imprisonment in a palace cell. But Andronikos was not a man to be kept in a cage. He was a master of escape, and he managed to slip out of his cell and flee the city. His subsequent travels were the stuff of legend. He wandered through Russia, where he gained the favor of the Grand Prince, and then through the Middle East, where he served in the court of the King of Jerusalem, and then even as far as the court of the Sultan of Rome, Kilij Arslan II. Everywhere he went, he made friends and enemies in equal measure, leaving a trail of broken hearts and political chaos in his wake. His story is a perfect example of the cosmopolitan nature of the Komnenian age. A Byzantine prince could, with a little luck and a lot of cunning, move between the worlds of the Rus, the Franks, and the Turks, a feat that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. But for Manuel, his cousin's wandering was a constant source of embarrassment and frustration. Andronikos was a walking scandal, a living reminder of the instability that lay just beneath the surface of the Komnenian Golden Age. He was a problem that Manuel, for all his power and charm, could never quite solve. He was a loose cannon, and loose cannons, as we'll see, have a tendency to eventually explode. The final years of Manuel I Komnenos' reign were dominated by a single, catastrophic event, the Battle of Myriokephalon. For decades, Manuel had been playing a dangerous game, trying to project Byzantine power on too many fronts. He was fighting in Italy, he was meddling in Hungary and Serbia, and he was constantly dealing with the complex politics of the Crusader states. All of this came at a cost, not just in gold, but in focus. While Manuel was busy looking to the west, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, under the shrewd leadership of Kilij Arslan II, was consolidating its power in Anatolia. The peace treaty they had signed years earlier was a fragile truce at best, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that a final reckoning was on the horizon. Kilij Arslan II was a different kind of Turkish leader than the ones Manuel's father and grandfather had faced. He was a master of diplomacy and a ruthless warrior. He used the years of peace to unite the various Turkish factions under his banner, to build up his forces, and to prepare for the inevitable showdown with the Byzantine Empire. He knew that the only way to secure the future of his sultanate was to break the Byzantine hold on Anatolia once and for all. Manuel, for his part, was not blind to the threat, but his obsession with a grand, decisive victory clouded his judgment. He wanted to do more than just hold the line. He wanted to launch a massive knockout blow that would destroy the Seljuk Sultanate and restore the Byzantine Empire to its full Roman glory. He gathered a huge army, a vast host of Byzantine soldiers, mercenaries, and Western allies, and marched them deep into Turkish territory in 1176. This was to be his great triumphal procession, his final glorious campaign. But Kilij Arslan was a master of guerrilla warfare. He knew he could not defeat Manuel's massive army in a pitched battle, so he opted for a different strategy, a war of attrition. He harassed the Byzantine army with hit-and-run attacks, burning crops and poisoning wells, slowly but surely weakening them. He lured Manuel's army deep into a narrow mountain pass, a place of steep cliffs and thick forests known as Myriokephalon. It was a trap, and Manuel, overconfident and driven by a desperate desire for victory, walked right into it. The Byzantine army, stretched out in a long column, was ambushed from all sides. Turkish archers rained down arrows from the cliffs above, while their cavalry attacked the flanks. The Byzantine soldiers, unable to maneuver in the narrow pass, were slaughtered. Their siege engines, their baggage trains, and all of their supplies were lost. The battle was a complete and utter disaster. Manuel, to his credit, fought bravely, but his courage was not enough to save his army. He was forced to retreat, leaving behind a field of carnage and the shattered remains of his grand ambitions. The Battle of Myriokephalon was a devastating defeat. It was not a total annihilation, but its psychological impact was immense. For a century, the Komnenoi had been slowly and methodically restoring Byzantine power in Anatolia. Myriokephalon brought that process to a screeching halt. It proved, once and for all, that the Turks could not be driven out of Anatolia. The region, once the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, was now a permanent part of the Turkish world. Historians often refer to it as Byzantium's last chance to restore its eastern frontier. The defeat had a profound effect on Manuel. The charismatic, optimistic emperor was now a broken man. He became withdrawn and despondent, and the illness that would eventually take his life began to take hold. His grand dream of a unified Christian empire was dead, and the empire he had worked so hard to build was now on the defensive. The defeat at Myriokephalon signaled the end of the Komnenian resurgence. The century of glory was over, and a period of instability and decline was about to begin. The once great empire, which had seemed so invincible just a few years earlier, was now a wounded animal, and the vultures were beginning to circle. The Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176 was more than just a military defeat. It was a profound psychological blow. For a century, the Komnenian emperors had been on a path of slow, steady recovery, pushing back the boundaries of the empire, reclaiming lost territories, and restoring Byzantium's place as a great power. Myriokephalon brought that momentum to a crashing halt. It proved in the most brutal way possible that the Seljuk Turks were not a temporary nuisance that could be dealt with, but a permanent fixture in the landscape of Anatolia. The idea of a full-scale Byzantine reconquest of the region was now officially dead. The military losses were severe, and the loss of prestige was incalculable. Manuel I, the great warrior emperor, was a shattered man. The charismatic, optimistic ruler who had dreamed of a new Roman Empire was now despondent and withdrawn. He had led his empire into a trap, and the consequences of his ambition were now clear for all to see. He had squandered the financial and military legacy of his father and grandfather on risky foreign adventures, and now the empire was left with a crippled army and a hollowed-out treasury. The vibrant, cosmopolitan court of Manuel's early reign was replaced by a more somber and cautious atmosphere. The golden age was clearly over. The defeat also had a devastating ripple effect on the empire's foreign relations. The Western powers, who had always viewed the Byzantines with a degree of suspicion, now saw them as weak and vulnerable. The Venetians, who had been nursing a grudge ever since Manuel's mass arrest of their citizens, saw their opportunity for revenge. The Seljuks, emboldened by their victory, began to raid deeper into Byzantine territory, a constant and draining threat that the empire no longer had the resources to counter. After Myriokephalon, Manuel's health began to fail. He was plagued by a chronic illness, and his once sharp mind became clouded with worry and paranoia. He spent his final years in the capital, a shadow of his former self, a man who had been broken by his own ambition. When he died in 1180, he left behind a power vacuum and a precarious situation. His heir was his young son, Alexios II, who was only 11 years old. The boy's mother, the Latin Empress Maria of Antioch, was appointed regent, a decision that would prove to be a grave mistake. The regency of Maria of Antioch was a disaster from the start. As a Westerner, she was deeply unpopular with the Byzantine aristocracy and the people of Constantinople. Her court was filled with Latin advisors and favorites, a move that alienated the Byzantine elite and fueled xenophobic sentiment. The Byzantines saw her as a foreign interloper, a puppet of the West, and her reign was viewed as an affront to imperial dignity. The empire, already reeling from the defeat at Myriokephalon, was now tearing itself apart from within. The political situation was ripe for a coup. The various factions of the Komnenian family, which had been held in check by the strength and charisma of Manuel I, now began to scheme and plot. The most dangerous and ambitious of these plotters was a man we've heard of before, Andronikos Komnenos, the emperor's wild, charismatic, and deeply unstable cousin. Andronikos, who had been in exile for years, saw his opportunity to seize power. He was a master of political theater, and he presented himself as the champion of the Greek people, the man who would rid the empire of the corrupt Western influence and restore it to its former glory. He began his campaign from the provinces, gathering a small army and a large following of disgruntled peasants and soldiers. He marched toward Constantinople, and his reputation as a rogue and a hero grew with every mile. He was a symbol of resistance to the hated Latin regency, a man who represented the old Byzantine ways. The people of Constantinople desperate for a change and resentful of the Latin empress, threw their support behind him. The stage was being set for a final, violent confrontation. This was not a quiet, political transfer of power. This was a revolution, and it was about to change the face of the Byzantine Empire forever. Andronikos, the man who had been a thorn in Manuel's side for decades, was finally about to get his chance to take the throne, a chance that he would seize with a mixture of charm and unbridled brutality. The story of Andronikos I Komnenos is a tale so dramatic it almost sounds like fiction. He was the first cousin of the late Emperor Manuel I, a man who, if his life were a book, would have filled a significant portion of the scandal section. He was born in 1118, the same year Manuel's father, John II, took the throne. From a young age, he was a force of nature, handsome, intelligent, and charismatic, but also a man with a serious problem with authority. He was a master of political intrigue and a man who couldn't stay out of trouble. His first run-in with his cousin, Manuel, came when he was caught plotting against the emperor. Manuel, ever the forgiving ruler, only imprisoned him, a decision that would prove to be a grave mistake. Andronikos, a man who was clearly not designed for a life behind bars, escaped from his prison in Constantinople in a dramatic fashion, using a series of disguises and bribes to slip out of the city. He then embarked on a series of adventures across the known world. He traveled to Russia, where he became a close confidant of the Grand Prince and helped negotiate an alliance with the Byzantine Empire. He then went to the Crusader states, where he served in the court of the King of Jerusalem, and even as far as the court of the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan II. Everywhere he went, he left a trail of chaos in his wake. He was a notorious womanizer, and his romantic entanglements with various princesses and noblewomen were the talk of the medieval world. One historian even described him as a man of great wickedness, of immense energy, and of an extraordinary charm. He was, in a sense, the ultimate political rogue. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Manuel I was struggling. His reign had ended with a disastrous defeat at Myriokephalon, and his death in 1180 left the empire in a state of deep uncertainty. The new emperor, Alexios II, was a child, and his mother, Maria of Antioch, a Latin princess, was appointed as regent. This was the perfect opportunity for Andronikos. The people of Constantinople and a significant portion of the Byzantine aristocracy were deeply resentful of the Latin empress and her Western court. The xenophobia that had been simmering for years was now at a boiling point. The defeat at Myriokephalon had discredited the Komnenian Dynasty, and the unpopularity of the Latin regency provided Andronikos with a powerful excuse to act. Andronikos, ever the master of political theater, positioned himself not as a power-hungry usurper, but as a savior. He declared that he was coming to Constantinople to liberate the young emperor Alexios II from the clutches of his corrupt mother and her Latin cronies. He was, in his words, the last true heir to the legacy of the Komnenian Dynasty, the man who would restore the empire to its former glory. He began his march on Constantinople with a small army, but his reputation preceded him, and as he moved closer to the capital, more and more people flocked to his banner. He was a symbol of hope for a people who felt betrayed and abandoned by their rulers. But the story of Andronikos' coup is not a simple tale of a hero's return. It was a brutal and bloody affair. As Andronikos' forces approached the city, a violent anti-Latin riot erupted in Constantinople. The mob, fueled by years of resentment and xenophobia, turned on the Latin community. They went on a rampage, slaughtering thousands of Latin merchants, bankers, and their families. The Latin quarter of the city, a vibrant and prosperous hub of trade, was a scene of utter carnage. The Latin Empress Maria and her court were powerless to stop the violence. This massacre was one of the most brutal acts of xenophobic violence in the medieval world, and it left a permanent stain on the Byzantine Empire's relationship with the West. It also provided Andronikos with the perfect cover to seize power. He rode into the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, an emperor who had come to bring order out of chaos. The young emperor, Alexios II, was still a child, and Andronikos, with a show of false humility, bowed before him and took on the role of his co-emperor and protector. But everyone knew who was truly in charge. The coup was complete. Andronikos Komnenos, the man who had been a political outcast for decades, was now the co-ruler of the Byzantine Empire. His rise to power was a testament to his charisma and his cunning, but it also showed the deep-seated instability that lay just beneath the surface of the Komnenian Golden Age. The stage was set for a reign that would be marked by a mixture of radical reform and unbridled terror. Andronikos Komnenos, the charismatic rebel, had seized control of Constantinople, and he was not shy about flexing his new authority. His reign, from 1183 to 1185, was a study in contrasts, a bizarre and terrifying blend of genuine reform and unbridled sadism. Upon taking the throne, he was, in a sense, the people's champion. He had ridden into the city on a wave of popular support, a man who promised to cleanse the empire of corruption and foreign influence. And in the beginning, he delivered on his promises. He launched a ruthless campaign against corruption, targeting the very officials who had grown fat off of the bribes and backroom deals of the previous reign. He punished corrupt tax collectors. He confiscated the ill-gotten wealth of the aristocracy, and he instituted a series of reforms designed to make the government more efficient and more just. His reforms were radical for their time. He established a system of fixed salaries for judges and bureaucrats, a move designed to prevent them from taking bribes. He made it illegal to sell imperial offices, a practice that had been a major source of corruption for centuries. He even went so far as to build new roads and bridges, a sign of his commitment to improving the lives of his subjects. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Andronikos was a true reformer, a man who, for all his personal vices, was genuinely committed to the welfare of his people. But this period of reform was quickly followed by a period of unparalleled terror. Andronikos was a deeply paranoid man. He trusted no one, and he saw traitors everywhere he looked. He began to turn on the very people who had helped him come to power. He launched a brutal purge of the aristocracy, accusing them of plotting against him and having them arrested, tortured, and executed. The public executions were a macabre and theatrical display of his power, a message to all who would dare to challenge his authority. He was, in a sense, a medieval version of a modern dictator, a man who used a combination of popular support and extreme violence to consolidate his power. The young emperor, Alexios II was a major obstacle in Andronikos's path. He was the legitimate heir to the throne, a living reminder that Andronikos was a usurper. Andronikos dealt with this problem in the most ruthless way possible. He had the young boy, his cousin, strangled to death, a quiet and horrific act that was kept a secret from the people of Constantinople. He then had the Latin empress, Maria of Antioch, the boy's mother, put on trial for treason and had her executed as well. The last remnants of the old Komnenian order were now gone, and Andronikos was the sole ruler of the empire. His reign was a constant series of rebellions and counter-rebellions. The aristocracy, terrified of his purges, rose up in open revolt. The provinces, which had initially supported him, were now turning against him. Andronikos responded to every rebellion with an even more brutal show of force. He was a man with a serious problem with anger management, and his rage was a terrifying thing to behold. A popular little anecdote from the time tells of Andronikos, upon hearing of a rebellion, simply snapping his fingers and ordering the execution of dozens of innocent people. It's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but it gives you a good sense of his temperament. Andronikos's paranoia was not entirely unfounded. He was, after all, a usurper, and there were plenty of people who wanted to see him dead. But his response was so extreme, so brutal, that it turned a political struggle into a campaign of mass terror. His reign was a dark chapter in the history of the Komnenian Dynasty, a stark reminder that even a golden age can end in a shower of blood. The stage was now set for his downfall. The people of Constantinople, who had initially hailed him as a hero, were now living in a state of fear. The man who had promised to save the empire was now its greatest threat. The next act of this drama would be his last. The reign of Andronikos, the refer of Komnenos, was a ticking time bomb. The man who had entered Constantinople as a populist hero was now a paranoid despot, and his brutal purges of the aristocracy and his ruthless executions had turned the city against him. He was a tyrant who had isolated himself from the very people he needed to rule. The turning point came in the autumn of 1185, a date that would be forever etched in the memory of the city. A small event, a single act of defiance, would ignite a full-scale revolution. Andronikos, in his constant state of paranoia, had sent a detachment of guards to arrest a young nobleman named Isaac Angelos. Isaac was not a particularly important figure, but he was a member of a powerful aristocratic family that had been a constant target of Andronikos's purges. When the guards arrived at his house, Isaac, knowing that arrest meant certain death, drew his sword and fought back. In the ensuing struggle, he killed the lead guard and managed to escape, fleeing to a nearby church. The news of his defiance spread like wildfire through the streets of Constantinople. For a city living in a state of terror, Isaac Angelos was a symbol of hope, a man who had dared to stand up to the tyrant. The people of Constantinople, who had been simmering with resentment for years, finally had a reason to act. A mob chanting, "Down with the tyrant," and "Long live Isaac Angelos," began to gather in the streets. The rebellion grew with astonishing speed. The imperial guard, which had been so loyal to Andronikos, now stood aside and watched as the mob stormed the great palace. Andronikos, who had always relied on his personal charisma and the fear he inspired, was now completely isolated. His loyalists were nowhere to be found, and the city that had once cheered for him was now calling for his blood. Andronikos was caught completely off guard. He had been a master of political maneuvering, but he had failed to see that his terror had turned the very people he claimed to champion against him. He fled to the palace and barricaded himself inside, but it was no use. The mob, a furious and unstoppable force, broke down the doors and poured inside. Andronikos was no longer a king. He was a terrified man running for his life. He was found hiding in the palace and dragged out into the streets, where he was subjected to one of the most brutal and horrific public executions in Byzantine history. The mob, in its unbridled fury, was a force of pure vengeance. They mutilated him, they tortured him, and they paraded him through the city for days. It was a terrifying and gruesome end for a man who had been a living legend, a final act of a reign that had been born in violence and ended in an orgy of blood. The death of Andronikos Komnenos was not just the end of a reign, it was the end of an era. The Komnenian Dynasty, which had saved the empire from the brink of collapse and had given it a century of glory, was now gone. Its final emperor, the wild and charismatic Andronikos, had ended its story in a shower of blood and fire. With Andronikos dead, the mob turned to Isaac Angelos. He was hauled from his sanctuary, and in a moment of sheer chaos and opportunism, proclaimed emperor. The Angeloi family, which had been in the shadow of the Komnenoi for generations, was now in power. Isaac II Angelos, the man who had sparked the revolution, was a far cry from the great warrior emperors of the Komnenian Dynasty. He was a man who had stumbled into the throne by chance, and he would prove to be completely unsuited for the task. The empire, which had been so strong and so prosperous under the Komnenoi, was now in the hands of a weak and incompetent ruler. The decline that had begun with Myriokephalon was about to accelerate into a freefall. The stage was set for a new era, one defined by corruption, incompetence, and ultimately a catastrophe that would change the course of European history forever. The reign of Isaac II Angelos, the man who had stumbled into the throne on a wave of popular fury, was the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. He was not a warrior like the Komnenoi, nor a shrewd politician like Alexios I. He was a man of luxury, a lover of extravagant spectacles and courtly splendor, but a man who was utterly unsuited for the demands of ruling a vast and complex empire. The Angeloi dynasty, which would rule for a little under 2 decades, was a period of systemic decay and fatal mismanagement. The empire, which had been so strong and so prosperous under the Komnenoi, was now in the hands of a weak and incompetent ruler. Isaac's most pressing problem was money. The wars of Manuel I and the purges of Andronikos I had drained the imperial treasury. The empire was in desperate need of cash, and Isaac's solution was to sell off imperial offices and titles. He created a new class of aristocrats, men who had paid vast sums for their positions, and he filled the bureaucracy with his own corrupt favorites. This had 2 devastating consequences. First, it alienated the old Byzantine aristocracy, who saw their power and prestige being sold to the highest bidder. Second, it filled the government with incompetent and corrupt officials, men who were more interested in lining their own pockets than in serving the state. This led to a breakdown of law and order, a rise in crime and corruption, and a general feeling of cynicism and despair among the population. A popular saying at the time was that the Angeloi were so inept they could make the sun rise in the west. It was, of course, a joke, but it perfectly captured the public's opinion of their new rulers. One of the most immediate and catastrophic consequences of Isaac's mismanagement was the loss of the Balkans. The Byzantine Empire had been struggling to maintain control over the region for decades, but the Komnenoi had been largely successful in keeping the Serbs and Bulgarians in check. Under Isaac, this began to unravel. The Bulgarians, who had been a subject people for over a century, revolted in 1185, a rebellion that quickly spiraled out of control. Isaac, more interested in building new palaces than in fighting a war, sent a series of incompetent generals to deal with the uprising. The result was a complete and total disaster. The Bulgarians, under the leadership of the brothers Ivan Asen and Peter, managed to establish the Second Bulgarian Empire, a powerful and independent state that would be a constant thorn in Byzantium's side for the next century. This was a devastating blow, not just because of the loss of territory, but because it showed the empire's enemies that it was now a paper tiger, a great power that could no longer defend its own borders. Isaac's foreign policy was just as shambolic as his domestic policy. He was constantly making and breaking alliances, and he was completely unable to deal with the rising power of the Normans in Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire in the west. He was a man who preferred to bribe his enemies rather than fight them, a strategy that only encouraged them to demand more. He even had to pay a huge tribute to Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, to prevent him from invading Byzantine territory during the Third Crusade. This was a humiliation for an empire that had once seen itself as the equal of any in the world. To make matters worse, Isaac's younger brother Alexios was a constant source of trouble. He was a schemer and a plotter, a man who believed that he, not his brother, was the rightful heir to the throne. He was constantly plotting against Isaac, and his intrigues only added to the political instability that was already tearing the empire apart. This family rivalry would eventually come to a head in a very dramatic and painful way. Historians still debate whether Isaac II was simply a weak ruler, or if the empire was already so fundamentally broken that no one could have saved it. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but what is clear is that his reign accelerated the decline that had begun with Manuel and Andronikos. The stage was now set for the final, tragic act of the Byzantine Empire. The reign of Isaac II Angelus was a period of decline and decay, but it was his own family that would deliver the final, crippling blow. Isaac was not a man to inspire loyalty or fear. He was a soft, ineffectual ruler who preferred the lavish comforts of the palace to the brutal realities of governance. He spent vast sums of money on his own extravagances, from building magnificent new palaces to commissioning elaborate statues and spectacles. This kind of fiscal irresponsibility was a serious problem in a time of constant war and economic hardship. He even had a golden statue of himself erected in the Hippodrome, a move that was seen as the height of arrogance and self-indulgence. This kind of display was not just a symbol of his vanity. It was a clear signal to the people that he was more interested in his own glory than in the welfare of the empire. While Isaac was busy with his luxuries, his older brother Alexios was plotting. Alexios was a much more cunning and ambitious man than his brother, and he had spent years waiting for his opportunity to seize the throne. In 1195, while Isaac was away on a hunting trip, Alexios struck. He gathered a small group of conspirators, bribed the imperial guard, and seized the great palace. When Isaac returned to the city, he was met not with the cheers of the crowd, but with the cold reality of a coup. He was arrested, blinded, and thrown into a dungeon, a horrific but all too common punishment for a deposed Byzantine emperor. His young son, also named Alexios, managed to escape the city and flee to the west, a desperate escape that would have enormous consequences for the future of the empire. Alexios III, Angelos, the new emperor, was, if possible, even more incompetent and corrupt than his brother. He had come to power through an act of brutal betrayal, and he would rule with the same cynical disregard for the well-being of his subjects. He continued the practice of selling off imperial offices, and he was even more generous with his bribes and his lavish gifts to his favorites. His reign was a period of accelerated decline, a time when the empire's military was neglected, its treasury was emptied, and its authority was eroded. The empire's enemies, seeing its weakness, began to press in on all sides. The Serbs and Bulgarians were now fully independent and were constantly raiding Byzantine territory. The Seljuk Turks were a permanent and growing threat in Anatolia, and the Normans and the Holy Roman Empire were always looking for an opportunity to expand their influence. But the most dangerous threat to the Byzantine Empire was still to come, and it was a threat that was coming not from a traditional enemy, but from an unexpected source: the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was a military expedition launched by Western European powers with the stated goal of conquering the Holy Land. It was meant to be a great, pious undertaking, a noble effort to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. But as with so many things in the medieval world, a combination of bad luck, bad decisions, and bad intentions would lead it down a very different path. The Crusaders, who were largely French and Venetian, had no navy of their own, so they made a deal with the Republic of Venice to transport them to the Holy Land. The Venetians, remember, had a long-standing grudge against the Byzantine Empire, ever since Manuel I had arrested their citizens and confiscated their property. The Venetians, led by their brilliant and wily doge, Enrico Dandolo, a man who was almost completely blind but who had a razor-sharp mind, saw their opportunity for revenge. They agreed to transport the Crusaders, but for a price so high that the Crusaders could not pay it. The Crusaders, now stuck in Venice, were at the mercy of Dandolo. He proposed a solution that would solve both of their problems. He offered to transport the Crusaders for free if they would first help Venice recapture a rebellious city on the Adriatic coast. The city, Zara, was a Christian city, and the Pope was furious. But the Crusaders, desperate to continue their journey, agreed. This was the first major detour of the Fourth Crusade, a deviation from its original goal that would set a terrifying precedent. This was a major turning point, a moment when the crusade began to lose its spiritual focus and become a tool for political and economic gain. But it was just the beginning of a series of missteps that would lead the Crusaders to the walls of Constantinople and to a betrayal that would change the course of history forever. The Fourth Crusade had already veered dangerously off course, and its next stop was Constantinople. The Crusaders, having just sacked the Christian city of Zara at the behest of the Venetians, were now a deeply compromised force, but their journey was not yet over. They were approached by a young man with a desperate plea, Alexios Angelos, the son of the deposed emperor Isaac II. Remember, Isaac had been blinded and imprisoned by his own brother, Alexios III. The young Alexios, who had escaped to the west, was now seeking a way to reclaim his father's throne. He saw the Crusaders as the perfect army to achieve this. The young prince, Alexios IV, as he would be known, made the Crusaders an offer they couldn't refuse. He promised them a staggering amount of money, a sum so vast it would solve all their financial problems. He also promised to put the entire Byzantine military and navy at their disposal for the Holy Land Crusade, and even more significantly, he promised to end the Great Schism and bring the Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope. For the Crusaders, this was a tempting offer. They had a massive debt to the Venetians, and this was their chance to pay it off and to get back on track with their holy mission. For the Venetians, it was an even better deal. It would give them a chance to take revenge on the Byzantines and to install a puppet emperor who would grant them even more trading privileges. Enrico Dandolo, the brilliant and ruthless Doge of Venice, was the driving force behind this new plan. He convinced the Crusaders that helping Alexios IV was not a detour from their mission, but an essential step toward it. He argued that the Byzantines had betrayed the Christian cause, and that restoring the rightful emperor was an act of piety. The Crusaders, who were already a long way from home and were in desperate need of a moral compass, agreed. They loaded their ships and set sail not for the Holy Land, but for Constantinople. The sight of the Crusader fleet, a massive armada of Venetian galleys and transports sailing toward the walls of Constantinople, must have been a terrifying spectacle for the inhabitants. The city, which had not been seriously threatened by a foreign enemy in centuries, was now facing an army of its fellow Christians. The Byzantines, under the incompetent rule of Alexios III, were woefully unprepared. Their navy was a shadow of its former self, and their army was neglected and undisciplined. Alexios III, a man who had come to power through betrayal and who ruled with a combination of indolence and cruelty, was a terrible leader for a city under siege. In July of 1203, the Crusaders began their first siege of Constantinople. They landed their forces and began to attack the city from both land and sea. The Venetians, with their superior naval power, were particularly effective. The Byzantine defenders, a disorganized and unmotivated force, were no match for the Crusaders' determination and fighting skill. The siege was a short and brutal affair. Alexios III, seeing that the situation was hopeless, panicked. He gathered as much of the imperial treasure as he could and fled the city in the dead of night. a coward's escape that would forever tarnish his name. The citizens of Constantinople, now leaderless, had no choice but to surrender. They opened the gates and welcomed the Crusaders into the city. The Crusaders, in a show of triumph, restored the blinded Isaac II to the throne, and with him his son, Alexios IV, as co-emperor. It was a bizarre and humiliating moment for the Byzantine Empire. Their emperor had been restored not by their own will, but by a foreign army. The first siege of Constantinople had been a success for the Crusaders, but it was just the beginning of their troubles. The young Alexios IV had made a lot of promises, and now it was time to see if he could deliver on them. The Crusaders had succeeded in their first objective. They had restored Alexios IV to the throne, but their victory was built on a foundation of empty promises. The young emperor, who had lived in exile for years, had no idea just how bankrupt the Byzantine Empire had become. He had promised the Crusaders a king's ransom in gold, a sum so vast it would have bankrupted even the wealthiest kingdom in Europe. He had also promised to place the Byzantine Church under the authority of the Pope, a move that was deeply unpopular with the clergy and the people of Constantinople. These were not just empty promises. They were politically and economically impossible to fulfill. Alexios IV, now co-emperor with his father, the blinded Isaac II, was in an impossible situation. He had a massive foreign army camped outside his city walls, an army that was demanding payment, and a population that was deeply resentful of his reliance on foreigners. He tried to raise the money he had promised by confiscating church treasures and by levying a new, heavy tax on the people. This was a catastrophic mistake. It not only failed to raise enough money to satisfy the Crusaders, but it also turned the Byzantine people against him. They saw him not as a liberator, but as a traitor, a puppet of the Latins who was selling off their heritage and their religion to a foreign power. A popular little anecdote from the time tells of a statue of the emperor Alexios IV being torn down and sold for scrap metal. It was a clear sign of the people's contempt for their new ruler. The relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantines quickly deteriorated. The Crusaders, who had come to the city with the promise of wealth and glory, were now growing impatient and angry. They had done their part of the deal. Now it was time for Alexios to do his. They demanded payment, and when it was not forthcoming, they began to loot the countryside around Constantinople. This was a grave error. The Byzantines, who had been a neutral party in the conflict, now saw the Crusaders as a threat. The alliance was breaking down, and a new, more dangerous phase was about to begin. The situation came to a head in January of 1204. The people of Constantinople, furious at Alexios III's incompetence and his subservience to the Latins, rose up in a full-scale rebellion. They stormed the great palace and seized a new emperor, a nobleman named Alexios Ducas. Alexios V, known as Mortsouphlos, because of his dark, bushy eyebrows, was a fierce anti-Latin nationalist. He was a man of action, a complete contrast to the weak and ineffectual Alexios IV. He had the young emperor arrested, and in a brutal act of regicide, had him strangled to death. His father, the blinded Isaac II, died a few days later, either from shock or poison. The Angeloi dynasty was now officially extinct. The new emperor, Alexios I had a clear and simple message for the Crusaders. He was not going to pay them a single penny. He was not a man to be trifled with, and he immediately began to strengthen the city's defenses, raising the height of the walls and fortifying the battlements. The Crusaders, who had been so successful in their first siege, now faced a new, more formidable opponent. They had come to the city as allies, but they were now faced with a new reality. They were now invaders. This was a major turning point. The Crusaders, who had been on a holy mission to save the Holy Land, were now faced with a choice: retreat in humiliation or launch a full-scale assault on the greatest Christian city in the world. They chose the latter. The Venetians, in particular, saw this as an opportunity to finally get their revenge on the Byzantines and to seize the wealth of Constantinople for themselves. They convinced the Crusaders that it was their holy duty to conquer the city, that the Byzantines were traitors to the Christian faith. It was a cynical and self-serving argument, but in their desperation, the Crusaders bought it. The stage was set for the final and most devastating act of the Fourth Crusade. The Second Siege of Constantinople, which began in April of 1204, was a very different affair from the first. This was no longer about restoring a legitimate emperor. This was a full-scale assault on a Christian city by a group of its supposed allies. The Crusaders, now led by the Venetians and their formidable doge, Enrico Dandolo, were no longer interested in a peaceful resolution. They wanted revenge, and they wanted the vast wealth of Constantinople. The Byzantines, under their new emperor, Alexios I, were now fighting for their lives. Alexios I, in a desperate attempt to save the city, had strengthened the walls and had even tried to organize a popular militia. But it was too little, too late. The Crusaders launched their first major assault on April 9th. The attack was a failure. The Byzantine defenders, fighting with a renewed sense of purpose, managed to repel the Crusaders' landing parties. But the Crusaders, with their characteristic determination, were not about to give up. They regrouped and launched a second, more powerful attack on April 12th. This time, they focused their assault on the less defended sea walls. The Venetian ships, with their massive siege engines and their ladders, were the key to the attack. They were able to get close to the walls and to drop their landing parties onto the battlements. It was a terrifying spectacle, a storm of iron and fire against the ancient walls of the city. The fighting was fierce, but the Byzantine defenders, who had been weakened by decades of neglect and infighting, were no match for the Crusaders' ferocity. The Crusaders managed to breach the walls in several places and to pour into the city. Alexios I, the emperor who had promised to save the city, panicked. He fled in the dead of night, leaving his people to face the enemy alone. The city was now leaderless and in a state of complete chaos. The Crusaders, seeing their opportunity, poured into the city, and the sack of Constantinople began. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was one of the most brutal and devastating events in the history of the Middle Ages. The Crusaders, who had been promised a land of endless wealth, went on a rampage. They looted churches, they destroyed priceless works of art, and they slaughtered thousands of innocent civilians. They were not just a military force, they were a mob, and their fury knew no bounds. They ransacked the great library of Constantinople, a priceless collection of ancient manuscripts, and they melted down the golden statues and the sacred relics. The city was a scene of utter carnage, a testament to the savagery of a war that had been born of greed and betrayal. The sack of Constantinople was a tragedy of immense proportions. The city, which had been the greatest Christian capital in the world, was now a smoking ruin. The Byzantine Empire, which had been a continuous state for over 1,000 years, was now gone. The Crusaders, in a bizarre and audacious move, established a new state in its place, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. They divided the Byzantine Empire's territory among themselves, with the Venetians taking control of the most important trading ports and islands. The Byzantine people, now living under a foreign and often hostile rule, were a people without a country. A handful of Byzantine nobles managed to escape the city and to establish a number of successor states, the most important of which were the Empire of Nicaea and the Despotate of Epirus. These states would continue the Byzantine legacy in exile, a flicker of a dying flame in a world that had been turned upside down. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was a turning point in world history. It was the moment when the Byzantine Empire, once a bastion of civilization and a bulwark against the forces of darkness, was fatally wounded. It was a wound from which the empire would never fully recover. The Latin Empire would only last for a little over 50 years, but the damage it had done was permanent. The Byzantine Empire would eventually be restored, but it would be a shadow of its former self, a small, weak state surrounded by powerful enemies. The fall of Constantinople to the Fourth Crusade was a tragedy of immense proportions, a betrayal that would forever change the relationship between the East and the West, and a sad and bloody end to a golden age. The immediate aftermath of the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople was a scene of utter ruin and chaos. The Crusaders, having found far more wealth than they could have imagined, were now in the business of building a new empire. They had come to the East as a holy army, but they had ended up as looters and conquerors. They established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a new state with a Latin emperor and a hierarchy of Western feudal lords. The Byzantine aristocracy, now scattered and dispossessed, were in a state of shock. Their city, the ancient heart of their empire, was now ruled by foreigners who had little to no understanding of Byzantine law, custom, or language. The Latin Empire was a cynical and brutal enterprise from the start. The Crusaders divided the conquered lands among themselves, carving out new feudal domains with little regard for the local population. The Venetians, in particular, got the best deal. They used their navy to seize control of the most important trading ports and islands, establishing a powerful commercial empire that stretched across the Aegean and the Black Sea. The Venetian Doge, Enrico Dandolo, who had been the mastermind behind the Crusades' diversion, took the title of Lord of a Quarter and a Half-Quarter of the Roman Empire, a truly ridiculous mouthful of a title, but one that perfectly captured the sheer audacity of the Venetian power grab. But the Latin Empire was a paper tiger. It was a fragile and artificial state, built on a foundation of conquest and held together by force. The Latin rulers had no popular support, and they were surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Bulgarians, who had been a constant thorn in the Byzantine side, now saw the Latin Empire as a new and even weaker target. The Seljuk Turks were a constant threat to their eastern frontier, and most importantly, the Byzantine people themselves, who had been a subject people for over a century, were now a constant source of rebellion and resistance. However, a small flicker of the Byzantine spirit remained. A handful of Byzantine nobles and generals had managed to escape the fall of Constantinople and had established a number of successor states in the provinces. The most important of these was the Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore the Southern Lascaris, a son-in-law of the former emperor Alexios I. The Empire of Nicaea was a small but determined state, a government in exile that saw itself as the rightful heir to the Byzantine Empire. It was a place where Byzantine traditions, law, and culture were kept alive, a kind of cultural and political ark in a sea of foreign rule. They faced incredible odds, but they were determined to reclaim their capital and restore their empire. The next few decades were a period of constant war and struggle. The Latin Empire was a chaotic and disorganized state, and its emperors were constantly fighting among themselves and with their Byzantine neighbors. The Empire of Nicaea, under the shrewd leadership of Theodore I and his successors, slowly but surely began to expand its territory. They recaptured a number of cities from the Latins and forged alliances with the Seljuk Turks and the Bulgarians. It was a slow and painstaking process, but they were determined to get their revenge. The Sack of Constantinople had not just been a military defeat, it had been a cultural and spiritual catastrophe. The Byzantines, who had seen themselves as the rightful heirs to the Roman Empire and the defenders of Orthodox Christianity, now saw their city and their faith in the hands of foreign heretics. The memory of the sack and the betrayal of the Fourth Crusade would forever poison relations between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West. It was a wound from which the Byzantine Empire would never fully recover, and it set the stage for a new and even more tragic chapter in its long history. The great city that had survived for over 1,000 years was now a ruin, and the civilization that it had fostered was a ghost haunting a conquered land. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a much deeper malaise that had been plaguing the Byzantine Empire for decades. The century of Komnenian resurgence, for all its glory and success, had also been a period of dangerous overreach and internal decay. The Komnenoi, with their focus on military expansion and a glamorous Western-oriented foreign policy, had neglected the foundations of the empire. They had relied heavily on foreign mercenaries, a practice that was both expensive and unreliable. They had also alienated the Byzantine aristocracy, who saw their power and influence eroding in the face of imperial centralization. But the most critical failure was the neglect of the Byzantine navy. The Byzantine Empire, a maritime power for 1,000 years, had let its naval strength wither. They had become dependent on the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa for naval support, a reliance that would prove to be catastrophic. The Venetians, in particular, with their vast trading empire and their formidable navy, were a rival, not an ally. The Byzantine emperors, in a series of short-sighted and self-serving deals, had granted the Venetians a near monopoly on trade, a move that enriched Venice while draining the Byzantine treasury. This was a classic case of selling the store for a quick fix, and the consequences would be immense. The final fatal blow was the sheer incompetence of the Angeloi dynasty. Isaac II and his brother Alexios III were a disaster, a pair of rulers who were more interested in personal luxury and political intrigue than in the well-being of the empire. They sold off imperial offices, they neglected the military, and they alienated the very people who could have saved them. The empire, which had been so strong under the Komnenoi, was now a hollowed-out husk, a state that was ripe for the taking. The Fourth Crusade was just the hammer that shattered the glass. The Crusaders, who had set out on a holy mission, were a product of their time. They were ambitious, opportunistic, and deeply xenophobic. They had no love for the Byzantines, whom they saw as heretics and traitors. The Venetians, with their long-standing grudge against Constantinople, were all too happy to provide the motive and the means to attack the city. The Sack of Constantinople was a tragedy of immense proportions, but it was a tragedy that had been a long time in the making. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade was a world turned upside down. The Byzantine Empire, once the bulwark of Christianity and the heir to the Roman tradition, was now a collection of broken states, a shadow of its former self. The Latin Empire, which had been established in its place, was a brutal and short-lived experiment that left a trail of destruction in its wake. The rise of the Italian city-states and their newfound dominance in the eastern Mediterranean was a direct consequence of the fall of Constantinople. The center of power in Europe was now shifting from the east to the west, a change that would have enormous consequences for the future of the continent. But the story of the Byzantine Empire does not end here. The Empire of Nicaea, founded by the exiled Byzantine nobles, was a state in miniature, a place where the flame of Byzantine civilization was kept alive. It was a place where scholars, artists, and soldiers worked tirelessly to restore their empire. They were a people with a purpose, a people who had been wronged and who were determined to get their revenge. They would spend the next few decades fighting a long and arduous war against the Latin Empire, a war that would culminate in the final, dramatic act of the Byzantine story. The Byzantine Empire would eventually be restored, but it would be a fragile and diminished state, a shadow of its former glory. It would be a state that was surrounded by enemies, and that was in constant struggle for its very survival. The golden age of the Komnenoi was over, and the long, slow, and painful decline of the Byzantine Empire had officially begun. The city that had survived for over 1,000 years had been wounded in a way it could never heal, a wound inflicted not by its traditional enemies, but by the very people it had tried to befriend. The story of the Fourth Crusade is a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed, betrayal, and the blindness of hubris. The fall of Constantinople to the Fourth Crusade was a catastrophe, but it was not the end of the story. From the ashes of the old empire, new states arose, each claiming to be the rightful successor to the Byzantine throne. The most important of these was the Empire of Nicaea, a small but resilient state founded in western Anatolia by Theodore I Lascaris, a member of the Komnenian Dynasty by marriage, and a shrewd and capable leader. He was a man with a singular purpose: to reclaim Constantinople and to restore the Byzantine Empire. He was a man of action, a warrior emperor who led his armies from the front, much like his father-in-law, Alexios III, had failed to do. The Empire of Nicaea was a kind of government in exile, a place where the Byzantine aristocracy, the Orthodox clergy, and the intellectual elite had fled after the fall of Constantinople. It was a place where Byzantine law, culture, and traditions were kept alive, a kind of cultural and political ark in a sea of foreign rule. They faced incredible odds, but they were a people with a purpose, a people who had been wronged and who were determined to get their revenge. They saw the Latin Empire not as a legitimate government, but as a temporary and illegitimate occupation, and they were determined to drive the Latin barbarians out of their capital. The first few decades of the Empire of Nicaea were a constant struggle for survival. They were surrounded by enemies on all sides: the Latin Empire in the west, the Seljuk Turks in the east, and the various Byzantine successor states who were all vying for power and prestige. But Theodore I and his successors were not men to be trifled with. They were masters of diplomacy and war, and they used a combination of clever alliances and military victories to slowly but surely expand their territory. They forged a crucial alliance with the Seljuk Turks, a surprising move that bought them time to deal with their Latin rivals. They also waged a long and arduous war against the Latin Empire, a war of attrition that slowly bled the Latins dry. The Latin Empire, which had been so powerful and so glorious in its first few years, was now a fractured and incompetent state, a shadow of its former self. Meanwhile, a rival Byzantine successor state, the Despotate of Epirus, was also gaining power. Founded by Michael I Komnenos Dukas, a relative of the Komnenian Dynasty, the Despotate of Epirus was a powerful and ambitious state that also had its eyes on Constantinople. This was a classic Byzantine struggle for power, a battle between two rival claimants to the imperial throne. The two states, the Empire of Nicaea and the Despotate of Epirus, would spend the next few decades fighting for dominance, a conflict that only served to weaken them both and to prolong the Latin occupation of Constantinople. It was a classic case of Byzantine family rivalry that was a constant source of trouble for the empire, and a bit like watching a family squabble over who gets to keep the heirloom that's still in the burglar's hands. The long and slow war between the Empire of Nicaea and the Latin Empire would continue for over half a century. It was a period of constant skirmishes, of sieges and counter-sieges, of political intrigue and diplomatic maneuvering. But the tide was slowly turning in favor of the Byzantines. The Latin Empire, with its corrupt and incompetent rulers, was a state in decline. The Empire of Nicaea, with its strong and capable emperors, was a state on the rise. The stage was being set for the final act of this long and bloody drama. The Byzantines, who had been defeated and humiliated, were about to get their revenge. The memory of the sack of Constantinople and the betrayal of the Fourth Crusade would forever fuel their desire for restoration. The Empire of Nicaea, the Byzantine government in exile, was led by a series of capable emperors, each building on the work of his predecessor. After the death of Theodore I of Lascaris, his son-in-law, John III Ducas Vatatzes, took the throne in 1222. John III was a man of immense talent, a ruler who was as comfortable on the battlefield as he was in the halls of diplomacy. He was a master of the slow, methodical advance, a man who understood that patience and persistence were more important than a single glorious victory. He spent his long reign from 1222 to 1254 consolidating the Nicaean state and slowly expanding its borders. John III's most significant accomplishment was his management of the Latin Empire. The Latin Empire, which had been so formidable in its first few years, was now a fractured and incompetent state, a shadow of its former self. Its emperors were constantly fighting among themselves and with their Byzantine neighbors, and they were unable to deal with the rising power of the Bulgarians and the Seljuk Turks. John III took full advantage of this. He launched a series of campaigns against the Latins, slowly but surely recapturing a number of key cities and territories. He was a master of the siege, and he used a combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering to wear his enemies down. But John III's reign was not without its challenges. He had to deal with the constant threat of the Despotate of Epirus, a rival Byzantine successor state that was also vying for control of Constantinople. The despot of Epirus, Theodore Komnenos Ducas, was a powerful and ambitious man who also dreamed of restoring the Byzantine Empire under his own rule. The two states, the Empire of Nicaea and the Despotate of Epirus, would spend the next few decades fighting for dominance, a conflict that only served to weaken them both and to prolong the Latin occupation of Constantinople. It was a classic case of Byzantine family rivalry that was a constant source of trouble for the empire. Historians still debate whether this internal conflict was a natural consequence of the political vacuum or a fatal distraction that could have been avoided. In addition to his military and political struggles, John III was also a great patron of the arts and sciences. He encouraged scholars to come to his court, and he commissioned the construction of new churches and monasteries. He was a man who understood that the restoration of the empire was not just a military and political task. It was a cultural and spiritual one as well. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a preserver of the Byzantine tradition, a man who was keeping the flame of civilization alive in a world that had been turned upside down. His son, Theodore II Lascaris, continued his father's work, but his reign was short-lived. He was a brilliant but sickly man, and he died in 1258, leaving a young son, John IV, as his heir. The boy was a child, and his regent, the general Michael Palaiologos, was a man with his own ambitions. Michael Palaiologos was a member of a powerful aristocratic family, a man of immense talent and ambition who saw his opportunity to seize power. He had no intention of ruling as a regent. He wanted the throne for himself. The stage was now set for the final, dramatic act of the Byzantine restoration. The Latin Empire was a state on its last legs, and the Empire of Nicaea was a state on the verge of victory. But the Byzantine world was still plagued by its old demons, political intrigue, family rivalry, and a constant struggle for power. Michael Palaiologos, the ambitious general, would be the man to lead the Byzantines back to Constantinople, but he would do so not as a selfless hero, but as a ruthless and cunning usurper. The stage was set for the final, dramatic act of the Byzantine restoration. The Empire of Nicaea, the Byzantine government in exile, was a state on the verge of victory, but the Byzantine world was still plagued by its old demons: political intrigue, family rivalry, and a constant struggle for power. After the death of John III Ducas Vatatzes, his son Theodore II Lascaris had a brief and brilliant reign. He was a scholar and a philosopher, a man who saw himself as a successor to the great Roman emperors of old. He continued his father's work of consolidating the Nicaean state, but his reign was cut short by his death in 1258. He left behind a young son, John IV, as his heir, a boy who was only 8 years old. The boy's regent was a man with his own ambitions, Michael Palaiologos. Michael Palaiologos was a member of a powerful aristocratic family, a man of immense talent and ambition who saw his opportunity to seize power. He had no intention of ruling as a regent. He wanted the throne for himself. He was a master of political maneuvering, and he used his connections and his military prowess to slowly but surely consolidate his power. He managed to outmaneuver all of his rivals, and in 1259 he had himself crowned co-emperor with the young John V. This was a classic Byzantine coup, a peaceful usurpation that was a prelude to a more violent act. In 1261, when the time was right, he had the young John V blinded, a horrific but all too common punishment for a deposed Byzantine emperor. Michael Palaiologos was now the sole ruler of the Empire of Nicaea, and he was ready to make his move on Constantinople. Meanwhile, the Latin Empire was a state on its last legs. Its emperors were weak and ineffectual, and they were constantly fighting among themselves and with their Byzantine neighbors. The city of Constantinople was a hollowed-out husk, a shadow of its former glory. Its walls were crumbling, its treasury was empty, and its population was a demoralized and apathetic lot. The Latin Empire was, in a sense, a victim of its own success. It had destroyed the Byzantine Empire, but it had no idea how to rule the people it had conquered. The Byzantine people, who had been a subject people for over a half a century, were now a constant source of rebellion and resistance. Michael Palaiologos, with his characteristic cunning, saw his opportunity. He knew that a full-scale military assault on Constantinople was too risky. The city's walls, for all their neglect, were still formidable, and the Latins, for all their incompetence, were still a force to be reckoned with. And so he opted for a different strategy, a sneaky, surgical strike. He sent a small detachment of soldiers, led by his most trusted general, Alexios Strategopoulos, to scout the city's defenses. The general, in a stroke of good fortune, found that the Latin garrison had left the city to conduct a military campaign elsewhere. The city was almost completely undefended. The general, in a moment of sheer audacity, managed to bribe a few of the city's guards, and with their help, he and his men slipped into the city and managed to open the main gate. The rest of the Byzantine army, which had been waiting just outside the city walls, poured into the city. It was a bloodless and stunning victory. The Latin Emperor, Baldwin II, was caught completely off guard. He was sleeping in his palace when the Byzantine soldiers, with the help of the local population, stormed the city. He fled in the dead of night, leaving his city and his empire behind him. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was now officially dead. Michael Palaiologos, The man who had seized power through betrayal and who had blinded a child was now the restorer of the Byzantine Empire. He rode into the city in triumph, and in a moment of great symbolic significance, he was crowned emperor in the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire was now officially restored, but it was a fragile and diminished state, a shadow of its former glory, and its long, slow, and painful decline was about to begin. The Byzantine Empire was restored in 1261, but it was a fragile and diminished state. The man who had restored it, Michael VIII Palaiologos, was a brilliant and cunning ruler, but he was also a ruthless usurper who had blinded a child to seize the throne. His legitimacy was constantly in question, and he had to spend his entire reign fighting to secure his power. The empire he had inherited was a hollowed-out husk, a shadow of its former glory. It was a state that was constantly under threat from its neighbors, a state that was plagued by internal strife, and a state that was deeply in debt. Michael VIII's first priority was to deal with the Latin Empire. The Latin Empire, though defeated, was still a serious threat. The Latin Emperor, Baldwin II, had fled to the west, where he was begging for help from the European powers. Michael knew that he had to act quickly to consolidate his power and to prevent the Western powers from launching a new crusade to restore the Latin Empire. He used a combination of diplomacy and military pressure to keep his enemies at bay. He forged a crucial alliance with the Genoese, Venice's bitter commercial rival, a move that gave him a powerful navy and a financial lifeline. He also managed to neutralize the threat from the West by promising the Pope that he would work to end the Great Schism and to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches. This was a purely political move, a promise he had no intention of keeping, but it bought him time, and it prevented the Western powers from launching a new crusade. But Michael's reign was not without its challenges. The Byzantine people, who had been so happy to see the Latin barbarians go, were now deeply resentful of their new emperor. They saw him not as a liberator, but as a usurper, a man who had stolen the throne from its rightful heir. The memory of the blinded John Thutz, the last emperor of the Lascaris dynasty, was a constant source of popular discontent. Michael tried to win over the people by restoring the Orthodox Church, but his political maneuvering with the Pope had alienated the clergy, who saw him as a traitor to their faith. He was, in a sense, a man who was hated by everyone, a ruler who was constantly walking on a tightrope. Michael's long and arduous reign, which lasted from 1259 to 1282, was a constant struggle for survival. He had to deal with the constant threat from the Latin West, from the rival Byzantine states, and from the rising power of the Ottoman Turks in Anatolia. He was a master of diplomacy and war, but his constant wars and his lavish spending on his court had a devastating effect on the empire's economy. The empire was now a state that was living on borrowed time, a state that was slowly but surely bleeding itself dry. The legacy of Michael VIII was a mixed one. He was the man who had restored the Byzantine Empire, but he was also the man who had set it on a path of long, slow, and painful decline. He had spent his entire reign focused on the West, fighting to secure his legitimacy and to prevent a new crusade. But in doing so, he had fatally neglected his eastern frontier. While he was busy fighting with the Latins, the Ottoman Turks, a new and more dangerous enemy, were consolidating their power in Anatolia. The stage was now set for the final, tragic act of the Byzantine Empire. The empire that had survived for over 1,000 years was about to face a new and more formidable enemy, an enemy that would not rest until it had brought the entire Byzantine world to its knees. The long and arduous reign of Michael VIII Palaiologos had secured the Byzantine restoration, but it had come at a great cost. The empire was now a fragile and diminished state, and its long, slow, and painful decline was about to begin. The man who had saved the empire had also set it on a path to its ultimate destruction. Michael VIII, with his constant wars and his lavish spending on his court, had fatally neglected the very foundations of the Byzantine state. He had weakened the economy, he had alienated the people, and most importantly, he had fatally neglected his eastern frontier. While he was busy fighting with the Latins and the rival Byzantine states, a new and more dangerous enemy was consolidating its power in Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were a new force on the world stage. They were not a great, centralized empire like the Seljuk Turks. They were a small but determined group of nomadic warriors who had been granted a small piece of land on the Byzantine frontier as a reward for their service. They were led by a charismatic and ambitious chief named Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Dynasty. They were a force of pure expansion, a people who were driven by a desire for conquest and a deep sense of religious purpose. They were a formidable enemy, and the Byzantine Empire, with its weakened military and its hollowed-out treasury, was completely unprepared to deal with them. The Byzantine Empire had been fighting a long and losing war against the Turks for centuries. But the Ottomans were a different kind of enemy. They were a new kind of power, a power that was based on military prowess and a relentless drive for expansion. They were a force that the Byzantines, who were now a state that was focused on internal squabbles and diplomatic maneuvering, could not comprehend. Michael VIII, with his focus on the West, had made a grave error. He had spent his entire reign fighting to secure his legitimacy and to prevent a new crusade, but in doing so, he had left his eastern frontier undefended. The Ottomans, seeing their opportunity, began to slowly but surely expand their territory, pushing the Byzantine Empire out of Anatolia, the very heartland of its power. The reign of Michael VIII's successors was a period of unmitigated disaster. His son, Andronikos II, was a weak and ineffectual ruler who was more interested in theology and philosophy than in the grim realities of governance. He disbanded the Byzantine navy, a catastrophic mistake that left the empire completely at the mercy of the Italian city-states and the Ottomans. He also relied on a series of incompetent generals and foreign mercenaries, a move that only served to weaken the military and to drain the treasury. The empire, which had been so strong under the Komnenoi, was now a state that was on its knees, a state that was living on borrowed time. The Ottoman Turks, seeing the empire's weakness, began to press in on all sides. They captured a number of key Byzantine cities in Anatolia, and they began to raid deep into Byzantine territory. The Byzantines, who were now a state that was constantly under threat, were unable to mount a serious counterattack. The once great empire was now reduced to a small, isolated state, a state that was surrounded by powerful enemies and that was in constant struggle for its very survival. The story of the Byzantine Empire was now a story of a long, slow, and painful death. The empire, which had survived for over 1,000 years, was now a state that was on the verge of collapse. Its long, slow, and painful decline was a testament to the fact that even the greatest of empires can fall. The story of the Byzantine Empire is a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, of internal strife, and of a failure to adapt to a changing world. It is a story that reminds us that even the most powerful of empires can fall, and that even the most ancient of civilizations can disappear into the mists of time. The last 2 centuries of the Byzantine Empire were a slow, agonizing death. The empire, which had once ruled the Mediterranean, was now a small, isolated state, a city with a handful of territories surrounded by powerful enemies. The Palaiologos dynasty, which had restored the empire, was a period of constant war and civil strife. The emperors, who were a succession of weak and incompetent rulers, were constantly fighting among themselves and with their powerful neighbors. They had squandered the legacy of their ancestors, and they had left the empire a shadow of its former self. The once great empire was now a state that was on the verge of collapse. The Ottomans, seeing the empire's weakness, were a force of pure expansion. They were a people who were driven by a desire for conquest and a deep sense of religious purpose. They had a singular goal: to conquer Constantinople and to bring the entire Byzantine world to its knees. They were a formidable enemy, and the Byzantines, who were now a state that was focused on internal squabbles and diplomatic maneuvering, could not comprehend the new kind of power that was rising in the East. The Ottomans, with their relentless drive for expansion, were a force that the Byzantines could not stop. The Byzantine Empire was now a state that was living on borrowed time. It was a state that was constantly under threat, a state that was bleeding itself dry with its constant wars and its internal strife. The emperors, who were a succession of weak and incompetent rulers, were constantly begging for help from the West. They were constantly sending emissaries to the Pope and to the European monarchs, asking for a new crusade to save them from the Ottomans. But the Western powers, with their long-standing grudge against the Byzantines and their own internal problems, were not interested. They saw the Byzantine Empire not as a bulwark against the forces of darkness, but as a weak and unreliable ally, a state that was on the verge of collapse. The fall of the Byzantine Empire was a slow, agonizing process. The Ottomans, with their constant sieges and their relentless pressure, were slowly but surely chipping away at the empire's territory. They captured a number of key Byzantine cities in Anatolia and the Balkans, and they began to raid deep into Byzantine territory. The Byzantines, who were now a state that was constantly under threat, were unable to mount a serious counterattack. The once great empire was now reduced to a small, isolated state, a state that was surrounded by powerful enemies and that was in constant struggle for its very survival. The final tragic act of the Byzantine Empire began in 1453. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, a brilliant and ambitious young man, set his sights on Constantinople. He was determined to conquer the city, the ancient heart of the Byzantine Empire, and to make it the capital of his new empire. He gathered a massive army, an army of over 80,000 men, and a fleet of over 100 ships, and he laid siege to the city. The Byzantine Empire, with its weakened military and its hollowed-out treasury, was a state that was completely unprepared to deal with such a massive force. The siege of Constantinople was a desperate and heroic struggle. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine the Palaiologos, a man who was a shadow of the great warrior emperors of the past, was a man who was a symbol of the empire's final tragic stand. He was a man who knew that his cause was lost, but he was a man who was determined to fight to the very end. He was a man who would die in a final, futile gesture of defiance, a man who would be remembered not for his victories, but for his glorious defeat. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 was a final desperate struggle for a dying empire. The Byzantine Empire, now reduced to little more than the city itself, was a ghost haunting its own former greatness. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, was a brilliant and ambitious young man who was determined to conquer the city, the ancient heart of the Byzantine Empire, and to make it the capital of his new empire. He was a man with a singular purpose, and he was not about to be deterred by the city's formidable walls or its ancient legacy. He gathered a massive army, an army of over 80,000 men and a fleet of over 100 ships, a force that was a testament to the new kind of power that was rising in the East. The Byzantines, with a garrison of only 7,000 men, were a small and desperate force. They were led by their emperor, Constantine the Palaiologos, a man who was a symbol of the empire's final, tragic stand. He was a man who knew that his cause was lost, but he was a man who was determined to fight to the very end. He was a man who would be remembered not for his victories, but for his glorious defeat. He was a man who was a symbol of the Byzantine spirit, a spirit of defiance and of a refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Ottomans began their siege in April of 1453. They used a new and terrifying weapon, a massive cannon forged by a Hungarian engineer that could fire cannonballs of over 600 pounds. This was a weapon that the Byzantines, with their old and crumbling walls, could not withstand. The Ottoman cannon pounded the city walls day and night, slowly but surely creating massive breaches in the ancient defenses. The Byzantines, with their small and undermanned garrison, were unable to repair the walls as quickly as the Ottomans could destroy them. It was a classic case of an irresistible force meeting a not-so-immovable object. But the Byzantines were not about to give up without a fight. They launched a series of desperate counterattacks, and they even managed to burn a number of the Ottoman ships. They also had a secret weapon of their own, the chain that they had stretched across the Golden Horn, the city's harbor, a chain that prevented the Ottoman fleet from getting close to the city's walls. This was a brilliant piece of engineering, but it was not enough to save the city. The Ottomans, in a stunning feat of ingenuity, simply built a series of massive rollers and hauled their ships overland, past the chain and into the Golden Horn. It was a move that was as audacious as it was brilliant, a move that showed the new kind of power that was rising in the East. The siege of Constantinople was a long and arduous struggle. For over 50 days, the Byzantines fought to defend their city, a small and desperate force fighting against a massive and determined enemy. They were a people who were fighting for their very survival, a people who were fighting for their religion, their culture, and their ancient legacy. They were a people who knew that if they lost, their civilization would disappear from the face of the earth. But their bravery was not enough to save them. The end was near. The end was near. After weeks of relentless pounding, the walls of Constantinople were crumbling. The Ottoman army, with its overwhelming numbers and its massive cannon, was a force that the Byzantines, with their small and desperate garrison, could not withstand. The final assault began on the morning of May 29th, 1453. The Ottomans, in a series of massive waves, launched a full-scale assault on the city. The first wave was made up of the irregulars, the raw recruits who were sent in to exhaust the Byzantine defenders. The second wave was made up of the Anatolian soldiers, a more disciplined and well-trained force. And the final wave, the most fearsome of all, was made up of the Janissaries, the elite shock troops of the Ottoman army, a force of well-armed and fanatical warriors who were a terrifying sight to behold. The fighting was fierce, a brutal hand-to-hand struggle on the crumbling walls of the city. The Byzantine defenders, fighting for their lives and for their ancient legacy, were a small and desperate force. They fought with a bravery that was a testament to their spirit, but their courage was not enough to save them. A small postern gate, a gate that had been left unlocked by a careless guard, was discovered by a small group of Ottoman soldiers. They slipped into the city, and in a moment of sheer audacity, they managed to open the main gate. The rest of the Ottoman army, with a roar of triumph, poured into the city. The Emperor, Constantine VIII Palaiologos, a man who had been a symbol of the empire's final, tragic stand, was a man who knew that his cause was lost. He rode into the breach, a lone figure in a sea of enemies, and he was never seen again. He was a man who died in a final, futile gesture of defiance, a man who would be remembered not for his victories, but for his glorious defeat. His death was a fitting end for an empire that had been a symbol of defiance and of a refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The sack of Constantinople in 1453 was a brutal and devastating event. The Ottoman soldiers, with a fury that had been building for months, went on a rampage. They slaughtered thousands of innocent civilians, they ransacked churches, and they melted down the golden statues and the sacred relics. The city, which had been the greatest Christian capital in the world, was now a smoking ruin. The Byzantine Empire, which had been a continuous state for over 1,000 years, was now gone. The ancient legacy of Rome was now in the hands of a new and more powerful enemy. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a turning point in world history. It was the moment when the Byzantine Empire, once a bastion of civilization and a bulwark against the forces of darkness, was fatally wounded. It was a wound from which the empire would never fully recover. The Latin Empire would only last for a little over 50 years, but the damage it had done was permanent. The Byzantine Empire would eventually be restored, but it would be a shadow of its former self, a small, weak state surrounded by powerful enemies. The fall of Constantinople to the Fourth Crusade was a tragedy of immense proportions, a betrayal that would forever change the relationship between the East and the West, and a sad and bloody end to a golden age. The final siege and fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just a military defeat. It was the end of a long and storied chapter of human history. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the last bastion of the Roman Empire was now in the hands of a new and more powerful force. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, who had conquered the city, was a brilliant and ambitious young man, a man who was as interested in art and culture as he was in military conquest. He was a man who saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a builder, a man who would transform Constantinople from a Christian city into the capital of a great Islamic empire. He immediately began the process of rebuilding the city, of restoring its monuments, and of transforming its churches into mosques. The Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Orthodox Christianity, was converted into a mosque, a symbolic act that showed the new reality of the city. The legacy of the fall of Constantinople was immense. It was the moment when the last vestiges of the Roman Empire were finally extinguished. It was the moment when the center of power in Europe shifted from the east to the west. The European powers, who had been apathetic to the fate of the Byzantines, now saw the Ottomans as a serious threat. The fall of the city and the subsequent expansion of the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans was a major factor in the discovery of the New World. The European powers, who were now cut off from the lucrative trade routes to the east, were forced to seek new routes to India and China, a search that would lead them to the Americas. The fall of Constantinople was also a major factor in the Renaissance. The Byzantine scholars and artists who had fled the city and had taken refuge in Italy brought with them the ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts that had been preserved in Constantinople for centuries. This influx of knowledge and of classical learning was a major catalyst for the Renaissance, a period of immense artistic and intellectual creativity that would forever change the face of Europe. The fall of Constantinople was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that also had a silver lining. It was a tragedy that, in a bizarre and unexpected way, led to a new and more dynamic age of human history. But for the Byzantine people, the fall of the city was a catastrophe of immense proportions. They were a people who had been defeated and humiliated, a people who had lost their ancient legacy and their spiritual home. They were a people who would continue to exist, but as a subject people, a people who would be ruled by a foreign power. The Orthodox Church, which had been the spiritual heart of the empire, would continue to exist, but as a tolerated minority. The Byzantine people would continue to hold on to their traditions and their faith, but they would do so in a world that was no longer their own. The story of the Byzantine Empire is a story of immense resilience and of an incredible will to survive. It is a story of a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years, a civilization that was a bulwark against the forces of darkness, a civilization that preserved the ancient legacy of Rome and Greece, a civilization that was a source of light in a world of darkness. It is a story of a people who were a testament to the human spirit, a people who were a testament to the fact that even the greatest of empires can fall, but that their spirit can continue to live on. The Byzantine Empire was no more. The fall of Constantinople was not a sudden, unforeseen event, but the final act of a long, slow decline. The empire that had survived for over 1,000 years, a civilization that had been a bulwark against the forces of darkness and a source of light in a world of turmoil, had finally succumbed to its fate. The legacy of the empire, however, would not disappear. It would live on in the art, the architecture, and the religious traditions that it had left behind. It would live on in the hearts and minds of the Byzantine people, who would continue to hold on to their traditions and their faith, even in a world that was no longer their own. The fall of Constantinople was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that also had a silver lining. It was a tragedy that, in a bizarre and unexpected way, led to a new and more dynamic age of human history, an age of discovery and of new beginnings. The long and storied journey of the Byzantine Empire had come to an end, and so too has our story for tonight. The sun of the Roman Empire, which had set in the west so many centuries ago, had finally set in the east. The long, dark night of the Byzantine Empire was over, but the light that it had cast would continue to shine. The memory of the empire, of its glorious emperors, of its brilliant scholars, and of its magnificent monuments would continue to live on in the hearts and minds of the people who had been a part of its story. The story of the Byzantine Empire is a story of immense resilience and of an incredible will to survive. It is a story of a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years, a civilization that was a testament to the human spirit, a civilization that was a testament to the fact that even the greatest of empires can fall, but that their spirit can continue to live on. And so, his story sank into legend, a forgotten tale of a forgotten people. The last of the Roman emperors, a man who had been a symbol of a dying age, was now a ghost in the annals of time, a ghost that would forever haunt the ancient city of Constantinople. The empire that had once ruled the world was now a memory that would be a source of inspiration and of reflection for generations to come. The long and winding road of the Byzantine Empire had come to a peaceful and quiet end, and with it, the story of a civilization that was a testament to the human spirit. Rest now. Let the ancient echoes of this story settle gently in your mind, like dust motes in a beam of palace light. The long journey is over, the battles are won and lost, and the emperors and the people have found their rest in the quiet passage of time. The sun has set on the golden domes of Constantinople. The city sleeps, and its long, slow, and winding story has reached its end. Sleep now. Sleep with the knowledge that the past, for all its turmoil and its drama, is a quiet and a peaceful place. Sleep with the knowledge that the stories of the people who lived and who died in this ancient and beautiful empire are now a part of the long, slow, and peaceful march of history. Sleep.